Agnes bolted upright, clawing at her throat. The smooth, steady hum that had been her constant companion for the past 2 years was gone, replaced by a terrifying silence. The oxygen mask felt like a suffocating plastic bag clinging to her face. Her lungs screamed for air, a burning ache that spread through her chest. Panic clawed at her. She ripped the mask off, gasping, but the air offered little relief. Each breath was a shallow, ragged struggle. Her fingers fumbled for the emergency inhaler on the nightstand, knocking over a framed photo of her late husband, Thomas. His smiling face mocked her helplessness. "Damn you, Harold," she wheezed, the words barely audible. She just knew, this was his doing. That vindictive little toad and his cronies at the HOA. They'd been escalating their harassment for weeks, small annoyances, fines for imagined infractions. But this was attempted murder. She finally located the inhaler and jammed it into her mouth, puffing frantically. A small measure of relief, but not nearly enough. Her vision swam, the familiar shapes of her bedroom blurring into distorted shadows. She needed help, and fast. Agnes reached for the phone, her trembling fingers struggling to dial 911. Each number was a victory, a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness. Her breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the sudden silence. 911. She managed to croak into the receiver when someone finally answered. "Need oxygen. Meadowbrook, Unit 4B. The dispatcher's voice was a distant murmur, lost in the roaring in her ears. She slumped back against the pillows, the phone slipping from her grasp. Clattered to the floor, the connection severed. Her life, reduced to a disconnected call, and a wheezing, desperate struggle for air. Agnes closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. She remembered a time when she could walk for miles, hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains with Thomas, her lungs filled with crisp, clean air. Now, she was a prisoner in her own home, tethered to a machine, her very existence dependent on the whims of a power grid and the malice of a petty tyrant. The darkness was closing in. This was it, wasn't it? The last gasp, the final, desperate plea for a breath that wouldn't come. And Harold Finch would get away with it. The thought, bitter and sharp, was the last coherent thing in her mind before the world dissolved into black. Harmony's discord, Harmony Oaks, sounded so peaceful, didn't it? Agnes thought, a bitter tang forming on her tongue. A collection of identical beige houses huddled together on perfectly manicured lawns, each blade of grass standing rigidly to attention. That was the illusion. The reality was a battlefield, and the weapons were bylaws and passive-aggressive newsletters. And then there was Brad Sterling, the HOA president, a man whose ambition shone brighter than the solar-powered garden gnomes he so vehemently prohibited. Agnes imagined him now, perched on his faux leather throne, meticulously scrutinizing satellite images for rogue dandelions. He was the kind of man who alphabetized his spices and probably color-coded his socks. Intelligent, undeniably. Ruthless. Absolutely. Agnes shifted in her chair, the thin cushion offering little respite from the aches that had become her constant companions. The oxygen concentrator hummed softly beside her, a sound that was usually comforting, a promise of breath. Now it felt like a ticking clock. It hadn't always been like this. When she'd first moved in, the HOA was a mostly benign entity, concerned with maintaining property values and organizing the occasional block party. But then Brad had arrived, fresh from some corporate takeover, and things had shifted. Small infractions became punishable offenses. Flower beds had to adhere to a specific color palette. Holiday decorations were subject to pre-approval. Now they were dictating her life, her wind chimes, her late-night reading. Soon, Agnes feared, the very air she breathed. Each new regulation felt like another brick in a wall, slowly closing her in. The bird feeder incident. Agnes Periwinkle hummed a wandering melody as she spooned sunflower seeds into the bright yellow bird feeder. The cool metal offered a small solace against the simmering anxiety that seemed her constant companion these days. Eager robins, busy sparrows, even a brazen blue jay, bounced impatiently on nearby boughs, their cheerful chirps a miniature orchestra of hope. A genuine smile touched Agnes's face, crinkling her kind eyes and easing the worry lines etched by time. This simple routine was a balm, a private act of grace in a world often devoid of it. Then the sun vanished. Brad Sterling, HOA president, loomed on her pristine lawn, his expression a stern reprimand. He clutched his clipboard like a judge's gavel. "Mrs. Periwinkle," he announced, his tone brittle enough to shatter glass. "We've received complaints." Agnes's smile wavered. "Complaints, Brad? Regarding what, specifically?" With a rigid gesture, he indicated the feeder, sunlight flashing off the lenses of his austere spectacles. "Breach of Article 7, Section B, Paragraph 3. Feeding wildlife is strictly forbidden. It attracts pests and compromises the community's curated aesthetic." Agnes's jaw set. "Pests? These are birds, Brad. Lovely, harmless birds." She brushed a fallen seed from her trembling fingers. "They brighten my mornings." "Regulations are regulations, Mrs. Periwinkle. You have a day to remove the feeder or face a fine." He scribbled on his clipboard, the scratching sound amplified in the sudden, pregnant silence. The next morning, the notice arrived. $50. The sum stung like a slap. Agnes filed an appeal, referencing her doctor's advice that she cultivate calming pursuits, highlighting the birds as a profound source of serenity. Her plea was rejected. Brad, in his curt response, quoted Article 12, Section A, Paragraph 8. The HOA retains absolute discretion in interpreting and enforcing all regulations. The following day brought another citation. $100. Nightmares began to plague Agnes's sleep. Swarms of crows descended upon her, their beaks like sharpened daggers. She felt cornered, crushed beneath the HOA's relentless pressure. It wasn't about the birds. It was about dominance. It was about Brad Sterling and his unslakable thirst for power over his domain. And Agnes, bruised but resolute, refused to surrender her voice. Red lines and final notices. Agnes swallowed, the metallic tang of the morning's medication coating her tongue. Dr. Chen's words echoed in her mind, each syllable a hammer blow. "Agnes, your oxygen saturation is declining. We need to keep you on the concentrator, ideally 24/7. No more strenuous activity, understood? I know you love your garden, but..." He hadn't finished the sentence, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "Or you'll be pushing up daisies yourself." Outside, the sparrows chirped, their tiny bodies flitting around the feeder Agnes had painstakingly filled. The small act of nurturing, of watching life flourish, was a potent antidote to the encroaching darkness she felt within. Until the cream-colored envelope arrived. "Final notice," the stark red letters screamed. Agnes's fingers trembled as she unfolded the document. Another violation notice. Another fine. This time for unapproved landscaping. Apparently, her burgeoning rose bushes encroached a fraction of an inch over the property line. The final line, bold and underlined, made her heart seize. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination of utility services. Panic clawed at her throat. No electricity meant no oxygen. No oxygen meant... She scrambled for the HOA directory, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Brad Sterling. She punched in the number, praying he'd answer. "Sterling residence," a gruff voice barked. "Mr. Sterling, this is Agnes Periwinkle. I received the final notice, and I need to explain." "Ms. Periwinkle." Brad's tone was dismissive. "The regulations are clear. 3 violations, unpaid fines. The board has voted. We're not running a charity here. But I need electricity for my oxygen concentrator. I have a medical condition. If you cut off the power..." "That's not our concern, Ms. Periwinkle. Comply with the regulations. Have a good day." The line went dead. The chirping of the sparrows, usually a comfort, now sounded like mocking laughter. Blackout. The flicker was so fast, Agnes almost didn't register it. One moment, the cardinals were vivid crimson against the feeder outside her window. The next, swallowed by an abrupt and absolute black. The hum of the refrigerator vanished, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. Agnes gripped the arms of her chair. Blackout. Not unusual in Florida during storm season. But the sky was clear, birds still chirping, albeit with a confused urgency. She reached for the lamp beside her, fumbling for the switch, but it was useless. The air felt suddenly thick, heavy. She pressed the emergency button on her oxygen concentrator. Nothing. Panic clawed at her throat. The machine's battery backup should have kicked in. Should have. Her chest tightened, each breath a shallow, rattling gasp. She lurched to her feet, knocking over the ceramic bird feeder she'd been cleaning. It shattered, shards of blue pottery skittering across the floor. "Damn it!" she wheezed, clutching her chest. She had to call Sarah. Now, stumbling in the darkness, she found her phone on the kitchen counter. Fingers trembling, she punched in Sarah's number. It rang, and rang, and rang. "Come on, sweetheart, pick up," she gasped, each word a painful effort. Finally, a click. "Grandma? What's wrong? You sound awful." Sarah's voice, laced with sleep, was like a lifeline. "Power gone." Agnes choked, her vision blurring. "Oxygen not working. Can't breathe." "Grandma, where are you?" "I'm coming." Sarah's voice was sharp with alarm. Agnes tried to answer, but the world was tilting. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the tile. The last thing she heard was Sarah's frantic voice, fading into a swirling vortex of black, before she slid to the floor. The silence returned, heavier now, punctuated only by the frantic chirping of the birds outside, oblivious to the still figure lying in the growing darkness. A granddaughter's fury. The robin's chirp was cut short by a strangled gasp. Agnes clutched her chest, the birdseeds scattering like glittering dust on the patio stones. The air thinned, each breath a desperate, rattling struggle. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the anxiety about the HOA. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Then, a roar, not of pain, but of a car engine tearing up the driveway. The back door slammed open. "Grandma!" Sarah's voice, a beacon in the gathering darkness, sliced through the fog in Agnes's mind. Sarah, her face tight with worry, knelt beside her, a practiced efficiency in her movements. "Oxygen now," she barked, already reaching for the portable tank she always kept in her car for emergencies. The hiss of oxygen filled Agnes's ears, a metallic song of life returning. Color bloomed back into her vision, chasing away the encroaching black. She focused on Sarah's fierce green eyes. "Brad. HOA," she managed, the words catching in her throat. Sarah's jaw tightened. "I saw the notice. I'll deal with him." She adjusted the oxygen mask. "Just breathe, Grandma. I've got you." A shadow fell across them. Brad Sterling stood on the patio, his face an unreadable mask. "Miss Walker, I presume? I was just explaining to Mrs. Periwinkle about the outstanding fees." Sarah rose, towering over him despite his height. "You cut off her power? Knowing she needs oxygen." Her voice was dangerously low, vibrating with barely contained fury. Brad's eyes flickered, but his voice remained even. "The account was delinquent. I wasn't aware of her medical requirements. There was no information on file." "No information? You couldn't bother to ask?" "She's 90 years old, you callous." Sarah took a step closer, her fists clenching. "You almost killed her." Brad recoiled slightly, his composure cracking. "That's a gross exaggeration. I followed procedure." Sarah stared at him, a cold fury replacing the heat of her initial anger. She saw not a man, but a system blind and unfeeling. "Procedure," she repeated, the word dripping with scorn. "Well, Mr. Sterling, let's see how your procedure holds up in court. Because this isn't over. Not by a long shot." "Attempted murder?" The yellow pages felt archaic in her hands, the flimsy paper whispering with each turn. Elder law attorneys swam before her eyes, a sea of names and numbers. She circled 3, the ink bleeding slightly. It felt like a betrayal, sifting through these names, admitting she couldn't handle this alone. But Mom deserved more than her daughter's fury. She deserved justice. Finally, she settled on Ms. Eleanor Vance, a name that sounded solid and unwavering. Eleanor's voice on the phone was equally reassuring, and an appointment was set for the following morning. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and anxiety. Sarah fidgeted, replaying the events in her head. Brad's smug face, the chilling silence when the oxygen sputtered and died, Mom's panicked eyes. Eleanor Vance, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper bob, listened intently, her pen scratching across a legal pad. Sarah poured out the whole story, the HOA meeting, the power shutoff, the deliberate targeting of Mom. She emphasized Brad's knowledge of Mom's oxygen dependency, the blatant disregard for her well-being. When Sarah finished, Eleanor leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "This is more than negligence, Ms. Walker." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "Brad Hollister knew your mother relied on that machine. He orchestrated a power outage that directly threatened her life. We could argue attempted murder." Sarah stared, speechless. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Attempted murder? Felt extreme, a leap too far. But as the shock subsided, a cold rage began to simmer within her. He had known. He had deliberately put Mom's life at risk. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Reckless endangerment would be a start. But the intent was there, Ms. Walker. The intent to silence your mother, the intent to punish her. And that intent, coupled with the near-fatal consequences, elevates this." The weight of the decision settled upon Sarah, heavy and daunting. This wasn't just a battle over HOA rules anymore. This was about Mom, about justice, about holding Brad Hollister accountable for his actions, no matter how monstrous they seemed. Trial by media. Harmony Oaks had transformed. Agnes barely recognized it. Where once quiet streets echoed with birdsong, now roared with the cacophony of camera shutters, shouted questions, and the thrum of idling news vans. Reporters, their faces etched with a mixture of hunger and fatigue, swarmed the entrance, held back by yellow police tape. The lawsuit had exploded, and Harmony Oaks was ground zero. Agnes, watching from her living room window, felt a tremor in her hands as she scattered birdseed. Even the familiar comfort of the sparrows felt tainted, their chirps lost in the din outside. Sarah, perched on the arm of Agnes's worn armchair, squeezed her shoulder. "Don't let them scare you, Aggie. They're just vultures looking for a feeding frenzy." On the television, Brad Sterling stood stiffly before a bank of microphones, his usually confident smile replaced with a grimace. "The HOA," he announced, his voice wavering slightly, "was unaware of Mrs. Periwinkle's medical condition. We acted in good faith, believing the unpaid fees were simply an oversight. We are prepared to offer Mrs. Periwinkle a generous settlement to cover all medical expenses and any undue hardship." Agnes scoffed, a surprising fire igniting in her usually gentle eyes. "Undue hardship? He nearly killed me." Sarah, her jaw tight, grabbed her phone. Time to set the record straight. She navigated to a news feed, typing furiously. Within minutes, a statement appeared. "Agnes Periwinkle refuses settlement. Vows to fight HOA negligence." The effect was immediate. A roar went up from the reporters outside. Minutes later, a knock echoed through the small house. Sarah opened the door to a barrage of flashing lights and insistent questions. "Mrs. Periwinkle, do you believe this was attempted murder? What are your demands from the HOA?" Agnes, fortified by Sarah's presence, stepped forward, her chin held high. "I want justice," she declared, her voice surprisingly strong. "Not just for me, but for everyone who has been bullied and ignored by this HOA. I will not be silenced." The cameras flashed, capturing Agnes, the frail woman who dared to stand against the machine. Justice served. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation, a humid blanket that clung to Agnes's skin. She clutched Sarah's hand, her knuckles white. Outside, the birds were silent, a stark contrast to the chirping melodies that usually greeted her mornings. Brad Sterling sat across the room, his face an unreadable mask. He had offered a pittance in settlement, an insult thinly veiled as generosity. Agnes had refused. This wasn't about money, it was about accountability. The trial began with a clash of words. The HOA's lawyer, a stern woman with a voice like chipped ice, painted Agnes as a nuisance, a rule-breaker whose oxygen machine was an unwarranted drain on the community's resources. Sarah's opening statement was a roaring counterpoint, a passionate defense of Agnes's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of her medical needs. The turning point came with the evidence. Sarah presented emails, unearthed from the HOA's server, detailing Brad's knowledge of Agnes's emphysema and her reliance on the oxygen machine. One email, sent months before the power shut off, explicitly mentioned Agnes's condition and the potential consequences of disrupting her oxygen supply. Brad's carefully constructed facade began to crack. During closing arguments, Sarah said, "Brad Sterling knew what he was doing. He knew the risks. He acted with callous disregard for Agnes Periwinkle's life." Her words hung in the air. The jury deliberated for hours. When they finally returned, the silence was deafening. The foreman, a young man with tired eyes, read the verdict, guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. Brad Sterling's face crumpled, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Agnes felt a wave of relief wash over her, so profound it almost buckled her knees. The judge ordered Brad to pay a substantial settlement, enough to cover Agnes's medical expenses and then some. More importantly, he issued a public apology, acknowledging the pain and suffering he had caused. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing, that truly mattered. Later that evening, back in Agnes's cozy cottage, Sarah sat beside her, a comfortable silence settling between them. The birds, sensing the shift in mood, had returned to their songs. "Thank you, Sarah," Agnes whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Sarah squeezed her hand. "We saved each other, Agnes." Their bond, forged in adversity, was stronger than ever. Justice finally had been served.